not want me to record anything.
The Japanese animation industry by far has had the best track record for book-to-screen adaptations. Manga to anime film and series adaptations rarely ever have such a hard time dealing with the flow from static illustrations to dynamic shots. The pacing remains, and though not all scenes stay, if you haven't read the source material, it rarely ever differs.
Live-action adaptations, on the other hand, honestly, on par with Shyamalan's The Last Airbender. The only valid ones I've watched are Gokushufudo and Kimi ni Todoke. Everyone else is on thin fucking ice. I said what I said.
The West, in comparison, has the worst track record for adapting from book to screen, and I mean this both animated and live action. Whether I'm talking about novels or comic books or video games, it never really pans well, and on the rare times it does, it either gets overdone or flops directly back into the ocean. Or on even rarer occasions, it grabs the source material by the lapels and takes the biggest leap of faith and actually does well for once. One such book-to-screen adaptation is The Haunting of Hill House, a Netflix series created, co-directed, and co-written by Mike Flanagan that was released in 2018, based incredibly loosely on the 1959 novel of the same name written by Shirley Jackson. Now, I have a lot of thoughts on this. There is an emphasis on based incredibly loosely because, for all intents and purposes, Jackson and Flanagan were telling different stories. It just so happened that Flanagan was using certain names, places, and even so far as taking lines verbatim from Jackson's novel. Now, I'm not the first person to have pointed these things out. I've done a lot of research while recovering from debilitating hand pains, and many critics of the show, mostly fans of the novel, have pointed out why taking these characters out of their original contexts to make a new story has its flaws. And that interests me.
Yeah, not the fact that most of these critics were fans of the novel. No, God knows I was such a critic of the Percy Jackson films when they came out. I understand their plight.
I'm interested mostly in what flaws there might be in the differences between a loosely based adaptation and its source material. Okay, before I unload all my opinions onto you, I gotta give my usual round of disclaimers. Since my aim here is to analyze what makes a good adaptation and what doesn't, I will be spoiling both Hauntings of Hill Houses without impunity, so spoilers ahead. In the interest of clarity, I'll be discussing certain details about the following media I am currently flashing on the screen. I probably won't be spoiling for many of them, but I feel like it's fair that you know. Many of these opinions are mine, but any that aren't will be properly credited in the outro and the description. A lot of what I will be saying here will sound immensely critical of Mike Flanagan and his adaptation of the novel, but I do want to say that it holds a very dear place in my heart, and I'm criticizing it objectively, as its status as an adaptation.
Alright, I hope that's enough to quell whatever flames might be sent my way.
Brief segue, but I do, in fact, have a curious cat. If you still want to send me hate, keep it out of the comments and in my inbox, because I will be deleting it the first chance I get. Okay, cool. So, our agenda here is I'm gonna break down what I'd expect in an adaptation and see if 2018 Hill House lives up to it. I'll start small, then work my way up to really show you the full picture. Alright, cool. Tone and framing. Film and series adaptations have to deal with the limitations of their budgets, the trends of the time, as well as the wishes of a production's producers. This isn't a solo project, after all. Everyone has their hand in this, so whatever leaves the writer's room might not actually make it to the big screen. Apart from budget constraints, and depending on how big your production studio is, when adapting stories, people will have to make certain decisions because of the change in medium and audience mindset. So with adapting novels, maintaining the tone and narrative framing is paramount in visually adapting it. And when it comes to Jackson's Hill House, it doesn't seem like that's such a hard thing to do. It's a relatively short novel that, if I remember correctly, only really transpired in this span of 2 weeks. 1963's The Haunting had already done so,
with its own liberties.
Suffice it to say that creating a visual shortcut to the tone and tension in Jackson's novel isn't impossible, so let's put it to the test. How exactly did Jackson frame The Haunting of Hill House? The external plot is centered on an anthropologist interested in understanding what makes a house haunted. He calls on participants for his study. Only 2 come back to him, and the owner of the house decides that there should be family in the premises in order for him to rent the house for the summer. So, Dr. John Montague, Luke Sanderson, Theodora, and Eleanor Vance decide to stay in Hill House. Internally, it's about Eleanor Vance and her experiences, not just of the hauntings that transpire in the house, but of everything else in her life. You learn more about her and just stand to witness how it seems she falls victim to the house's malicious intent. The main allure to Jackson's novel is in the ambiguity of whether or not Eleanor was responsible for her suicide and the hauntings that preceded it. So in adapting that story, did Mike Flanagan manage to recreate the tone and framing? A third-person limited perspective that traps you into the mind of a character who doesn't filter her own thoughts and, consequently, can't differentiate between the alleged actions of a malicious house and her own actions and intentions. Well, yes, actually. In the first 5 episodes of the series, we're introduced to each Crane child and are forced for around an hour to understand their side of the story. The show's external plot centers around Eleanor Vance Nee Crane's alleged suicide and the fallout of it in the present, as well as the weeks leading up to Olivia Crane's alleged suicide in the past. Internally, Steve, Shirley, Theo, Luke, and Nell are shown their good and bad sides.
Some worse than others, to be honest.
The show gives you each character's psyches. It's 5 consecutive character studies with 2,
or 3 if you count the royalties to Steve's novel, 4 if you count Luke's recovery,
external subplots to keep the series, well, serial.
But that's only the first half, SJ.
You may say.
What happened to the rest of the series?
Honestly, as someone who loves the show to death, I don't know either. I'm usually okay with cheesy endings in horror media if my love for the Fear Street trilogy isn't enough of an indication, but the last 5 episodes, despite reinforcing the Cranes themselves can't differentiate from the house's intentions versus their own actions, these episodes are shaky and break the character study format. This is where all the critics agree Flanagan failed the series, that he dropped the ball on tension, that he got a bit too cheesy at the end, that all the loose ends were cut off a bit too neatly. And I can't deny it, he really had us in the first half, I'm not gonna lie. I didn't mind the cheesy ending at first because I was going in blind, but after reading the novel and rewatching the series 3 years later, it seems disingenuous. For a guy who claims to love horror, Flanagan just dropped the horror in the final episodes. Sure, there are ghosts, but they're not the scary thing about the house. It's the fact that people keep dying in it. But it ends in love. Now, I'm not reading this in bad faith. I deliberately glossed over the incredibly different premises and tone of the novel and the series because, again, they're different stories. Flanagan's work is essentially transformative, and this adaptation is only loosely based. Despite that, I still have to criticize it because even though they're different stories, they're still both within the genre of horror, and Flanagan, or Netflix, decided to keep a lot of things from Jackson's novel. Flanagan wrote a horror drama based on a psychological horror, but decided to skim on the horror. Sure, you get the gross out moments, the jump scares, and a feeling of general dread from the fact that this house has taken 2 lives, but they satiate the house in the end, and the narration takes a turn that suggests that feeding the house a 3rd time is better than having died in it. If I were being subjective, I'd say it's because that ending is viewed through Steve, who's been known to be a skeptic and a coward, and that this is just consistent character writing. But nothing in the narrative actually contradicts his view of it, and audiences walked away from the series feeling relieved that the house took its, well, technically its 6th victim since the 60s. And the change of tone honestly would have been a lot more forgivable if the show and the novel, at the very least, had the same themes. For over 10 years, Mike Flanagan worked on the concept of his latest series, Midnight Mass. Now, I swear this is relevant, so hold your horses, alright? Midnight Mass, despite its religious framing, is internally about questioning faith's role in dealing with grief and loss and death, especially regarding a former abusive parent. And briefly, the story is also about the work put into recovering from and or overcoming addiction. And when I say Flanagan's been writing this for 10 years, this isn't speculation. He wrote an essay about it, and well, if I had the time to watch his entire filmography, I probably wouldn't have needed to read that essay anyway. Midnight Mass appeared both conceptually and literally in his film Hush back in 2015, cameoed briefly in his adaptation of Gerald's Game, and tonally has been all over his work since 2011. You see it in Absentia, Oculus, The Origin of Evil, and Dr. Sleep. There's almost always something about losing a parent, questioning faith and religious doctrine, and a character recovering from substance addiction of any kind. And it's not lost in his adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House. In fact, Flanagan's Hill House checks all of it off. There's a brief discussion about a Ouija board between young Steve and Claire Dudley, where Olivia cuts in and talks about how Steve was taught to look at all religious doctrines.
A fact that isn't incidental, as Flanagan himself did just that when he was in college.
Luke's entire story as an adult deals with his heroin addiction and time in recovery. Every single Crane child is dealing with the grief of their mother's death, who wasn't really the best parent in the last few days she had left. Then they also had to deal with their grief with Nell when she died.
Hell, I think that counts triple for Nell, who was also dealing with her husband's death.
These themes carry across even in Bly Manor, even though only a portion of Bly Manor was co-written and directed by Flanagan himself. Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House dealt with the fear of alienation, the contrarian nature of social anxiety and inferiority complexes born from years of abuse that was specific to unemployed and single women of Eleanor's age at the time it was written, and the way women have to handle hysterical fear at the time due to stigmas against mental illness.
And mental illness specifically, allegedly only manifesting in women.
I don't think I have to point out the thematic dissonance between these two works. In fact, I can keep doubling down because Flanagan didn't actually ignore these things in his adaptation. In the show, the Cranes bought Hill House to flip it, but prior to them, no one had stayed on the property since the 60s. The house was owned by the Hills. Robert and Poppy Hill had met in a mental institute and were deemed clinically insane, but rich enough to leave. They started a family, and then Poppy decided to kill each member of her family in a twisted sort of reenactment of the GRATTAN murders.
A song that Luke Sanderson sings in the novel.
Poppy even sings it briefly in the show.
The first was young Miss Grattan. She tried not to let him in. He stabbed her with a corn knife. That's how his crimes began. The next was Grandma Grattan, so old and tired and gray. She fit off her attacker until his strength gave way. The next was Grandpa Grattan, a settin' by the fire. He came up close behind him and strangled him with wire. The last was Baby Grattan, all in his trundle bed. He stove him in the short ribs until that child was dead. And then he spit tobacco juice all on his golden.
Steve, Shirley, and Theo seem perfectly alright with calling Nell crazy when she's in distress about anything. Steve thinks that the alleged mental illness that killed both Nell and Olivia was genetic, and he got a vasectomy straight out of college so that it wouldn't spread, calls it a rot, etc., etc. All in all, it's not a good look at what the Cranes think of neurodivergent people displaying any sort of antisocial symptoms, specifically the eldest three. And that's a lot considering Theodora is a licensed child psychologist.
Which could be a comment on the field of psychiatry and psychology's institutional ableism, but that would mean the show itself acknowledges its own ableism, so I digress.
And fine, let's play devil's advocate. Again, this series is transformative, and it's just using the characters' names and the settings and actual lines from the novel verbatim, and even using the novel's actual title, but it's a completely different story. Fine, with all of that in mind, the question stands. What was Flanagan's intent? It's been made clear by Ruth Franklin in uncovering many of Jackson's personal letters and various writings that Jackson always wrote about women, specifically women of her own standing. White, upper middle class, trapped in tragically terrible marriages or isolated in male-dominated workspaces, or even just very specifically outliers of the general white upper middle class female echelon, ranging from their late 20s to their late 30s. Maybe single or unemployed or both, maybe having experienced terrible childhoods like Jackson herself did. She wrote what she knew, and she wasn't afraid of sticking to her guns. Jackson did a shit ton of research before writing Hill House, inspired by a study submitted to the Society of Psychic Research, and the layout of a house that she hadn't known was actually built by her own ancestor. So, it seemed the intent of writing The Haunting of Hill House was to express the desperation of people, of women without connections, from completely different backgrounds to connect with not only each other, but also to a house so intent on terrorizing them. About alienation, about finally coming home, about what that could mean if the home you so desperately wanted only wants you so it could finish the job reality started. In an interview with Matt Edwards from Den of Geeks, Mike Flanagan expressed that he didn't want to do a remake of 1963's The Haunting, and trying to pull apart a novel as short as Jackson's into 10 hours was going to be a struggle, so they came out with what they did, for better or for worse. Again, Flanagan hadn't wanted to adapt the original story because 1963 already did it. And they came out with what feels like a little bit of a proto-Midnight Mass. No shade on the rest of the Hill House writers' room, it just feels like that. In that same interview, Flanagan actually says that the crew itself is built on by fellow Shirley Jackson fans, and they were very careful to try and not to anger the fans of the original novel. And I'm not a big Jackson fan. I only really know her work through this. I'm kind of considering digging up a few more of her novels to read, but her writing isn't exactly my cup of tea, so I can't speak on anyone else's behalf on this. But Mike Flanagan and the writers of 2018's Hill House were given this novel to adapt, a novel about the effects of female repression, social anxiety, alienation, female friendships, and especially about a woman, and made it about none of those things. You can't even argue for those female friendships because the women in the show wouldn't be talking to each other if it weren't about their families, or if they weren't fighting, or if they weren't fucking related to each other. And I don't know, I don't think that counts as a good adaptation, doesn't it? So I think I made it pretty clear that 2018's The Haunting of Hill House is a terrible book-to-series adaptation, which isn't to say that remixes of stories so old they can only marginally be relatable aren't good. HBO's The Watchmen did a pretty good job of that. Nia DaCosta's Candyman was a really good remake too, if I'm being honest. Does Anne of Green Gables count? I don't know, I haven't watched the show yet, so.
Why do I say yet like I'm actually planning to watch it? Anyway.
So, I don't think remixing the tone, themes, and intent of Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House into a 10-hour series is impossible either. Hell, Flanagan has a track record of making remixes instead of adaptations with all the Stephen King movies he's made, and
I can't speak to any of those either because I hate Stephen King.
I guess this was just a swing and a miss. Here's to hoping he doesn't miss again when he does that take on Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher, huh? Shout out to Jeanette for being a real trooper. This video wouldn't have been made without their help, and the help of all the lovely people who helped me get a keyboard. Thank you all so much. Do you hear that? Anyway, thank you all so much. Thank you for getting this far. If you like that, check out my other videos. Subscribe if you like the vibe. Back me on Patreon if you want early access to any videos, and help me decide which videos come out next. Stay safe. Ingat tayong lahat. Bye!